Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 20th week of 2017. I'm Carl Estabrook. For more than a quarter century, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for more than half a century. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and you'll sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things on a Getting On to Armageddon edition, referring to the fact that the President of the United States is off on a trip to the Middle East, where he will at least go by the ancient location of Armageddon, the prophesied location of a gathering of armies for a final battle. There is one sole mention of Armageddon in the New Testament, but that hasn't stopped Christian evangelists particularly for spinning a great mythology about the end time, even though the oldest Christian document that exists says, by the way, don't spend your time speculating about the end time. That's the first letter of the Thessalonians. In any case, Armageddon has this sort of mythical status, and it is an ancient site, in fact, of battles going back to the 15th century BC, but today it's a rather sleepy little lump in the ground. It's not even a hill, as the name implies, in northern Israel. But President Trump, a sleepy little lump in the ground in his own right, is on his way to a meeting first in Saudi Arabia, the United States' great ally in the region, and then off to its other great ally in the region, the State of Israel. From there, he will make several other stops, and finally the Vatican. And this is interesting in some ways because there is a theme in this administration about the three Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And the intellectual bodyguard of this administration, Steve Bannon, early on spoke a lot about a epical battle in contemporary civilization between the West, meaning, of course, the government of the United States of America, and radical Islamic terrorism, or radical Islam. There are a variety of views about the matter in the American government, growing out of the fact that the principal ally for American imperialism in the Middle East is, of course, a radical Islamic state, the most radical Islamic state, that is Saudi Arabia, Trump's first stop. So there are contradictions, for lack of a better word, in the American policy and the American notions here, but there does seem to be a consistent theme about civilizational conflict that we find in this administration that really is perhaps a departure from what we've seen before. I think the real basis is a conflict between corporate globalizers, neoliberals who've dominated all recent American administrations, and the peculiar sort of economic nationalism that we're hearing from Steve Bannon and in different ways from the Brexiteers in England and even the Le Pen people in France. We sometimes call this populism. But one of the things that's being played out in the Mideast right now is this battle by night between populism and American neoliberalism and neoconservatism, which dominate all American politics, and which Trump became president by attacking. So there are wheels within wheels, so to speak, not just in the air here, as Trump goes to Armageddon. What do you think of the situation, David?
Well, let me make a little tie-in here. There's an op-ed piece in the New York Times this morning by a guy named James Doran, I believe, about the matters of which you speak in the Middle East, which stating very straightforwardly what he feels U.S. interests in the Middle East are in relation to our primary allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel, and our prime enemy, which is Iran, and how that should be played out, and how Trump, and he proposes that there should be something called the Trump Doctrine. And what's interesting about James Doran is that he works at something called the Hudson Institute, which, if you recall, back in the old days, was identified with a kind of a scary guy named Herman Kahn, who liked to theorize about the use of nuclear weapons, about the sort of tactical use of nuclear weapons. So there's a little Armageddon tie-in for you there.
Yes, indeed, there is.
And what Doran is saying, though, on behalf of the neoconservative establishment in this country, is really very clear, and it's the same thing that's being said by critics of our foreign policy. I passed around what I thought was an important interview from the Real News earlier this week that Paul Jay did with a Canadian professor, an obscure Canadian professor of Iranian origin named El Nasri. I think putting very cogently what he feels, how he feels that people like Doran, although didn't refer to him, think that American foreign policy should be played out in the Middle East in a very blatant and brutal and self-interested way. And of course, it's important to note that the self-interest involved here, of course, is that of the 1% or even less. So that's the Trump doctrine. As much as it was ridiculed, as much as the notion of a Trump doctrine is ridiculed by the commenters to that particular Doran article. Well, how can you have a Trump doctrine when, or that it's an oxymoron that Trump would have a doctrine? Well, he doesn't have to have it, obviously. The deep state has it. And that's pretty much what's moving forward here, as far as one can tell in his visits to our various strategic allies in the region.
Let me try another fantasy on you. I started with the fantasy of Armageddon tonight, and I have another fantasy for you. This one is more my own, I guess, than the seers of the Book of Revelation. But the possibility occurred to me in the middle of the week, in the midst of all sorts of bad news, that this comparison that's coming up frequently of Nixon and Trump may have another dimension. The comparison has been made, of course, about Nixon and Watergate and Trump and his basically Russiagate. And this is mainly whole cloth and propaganda by the U.S. political establishment, which doesn't know if it can rely on Trump. The great fear that he might do something that is outside of that war provocation and pro-Wall Street activities that we've come to know and love in all recent American administrations. That's the reason they're upset with Trump. He's not playing by the rule book in terms of the rules established by the American 1%, which most American political parties and all American administrations have done for a while. Let's assume that there's a parallel with Nixon, not so much perhaps in the Watergate business, but in the other best-known element of the Nixon administration. Nixon goes to China. Right. The redoing of the relationship of the U.S. and China was arguably the most important effect of the Nixon administration. You have to remember what a tremendous shock it was to the American political establishment that the Chinese Communist Party triumphed in 1949. In some ways, it was a bigger shock than anything else that's happened, certainly since the Second World War and maybe before. That's the reason for that was that the U.S. foreign policy since really the end of the 19th century had been based on the exploitation of Asia and the notion that for the profits of the American upper class, the openness of Asian to American economic manipulation was paramount. Just down the road from where I used to live in Massachusetts, there is a fascinating museum called the Museum of the China Trade. And the Museum of the China Trade is based upon New England seafarers who spent a good bit of the post-Civil War era in America exploiting China. And the U.S. policy from at least the Open Door in 1899 was that China must be open to American exploitation. We couldn't get the nasty Germans or the Brits or somebody else getting in the way, and certainly we couldn't have an economic integration of Asia that would get in the way. Therefore, it was a shock when Mao Zedong led the revolution into Beijing in 1949 and excluded America. This is big time. This is serious. And therefore the turnaround in the Nixon administration and the opening to China was an even, in some ways, bigger deal because it set up the possibility of America abandoning its opposition to economic integration of Asia. Well, not quite. I mean, that's not what the U.S. has done. And in many ways, the Vietnam War was an attempt to hold on to that economic control of Asia to fight off the great fear that something else like 1949 in China would occur in Southeast Asia. That is, local people would take charge of their own economy, the Vietnamese. And if they did that, God help us, maybe even the Japanese would want to do it. They tried it once and we slapped them down about that, so they're not going to try it again if we make sure that our writ runs. So we're dealing with things that are very significant to long-term American foreign policy. Okay, Trump is off to the Middle East, and there has just been the greatest Asian economic meeting literally in generations, hardly covered by the American press. That is the One Belt, One Road meeting in Beijing, where 130 foreign leaders gathered to hear about China's plans for an economic integration of Asia, the one thing that American policy has been ranged against. At the same time, Russia has its own Eurasian Economic Union and is establishing what's essentially an alliance with China. Now, under these circumstances, the American control of the Mideast, which has always had an Asian reference, the America wanted to control the Mideast because control of energy gave America control of the economies of Asia in important ways. That's all about to change. The control of energy in the Mideast is less effective for controlling Asian economic development, and Asian economic development is passing out of American control. Okay, under these circumstances, is it time for another Nixon goes to China moment? Trump goes to China, or Trump goes to Eurasia? A real revolution in American foreign policy that would mean cooperation with the One Belt, One Road program of China, cooperation with the European Economic Union and the Eurasian Economic Union, instead of the attempt beginning specifically with the Clinton administration to destroy it. Is that possible? Is such a thing possible? Well, some people think so, and the people who think so are in the American political establishment. They're desperately afraid that this is what Trump or the Trump administration will eventually do, and that the economic nationalists around Steve Bannon and others are moving in that direction in a way that threatens, they think, the long-term interests of the American 1% of that American political establishment. A fantasy? Perhaps. But it will be an interesting week, and not just because Donald Trump might find people who want to talk about his impeachment. He's talking to Saudi Arabia, to Israel, and to the Pope. And on the agenda is the West versus Asia. It could be an interesting week.
But given the opening of China with Nixon, and then with China basically becoming a capitalist country, that's usually dated around 1985, the American neoliberal establishment is a very adaptive thing. And what we've had since 1985 in the 32 years is a neoliberal, a sort of explicit neoliberal agreement that will do business with China.
Exactly.
And that has been part, of course, of the war on the American working class. Chinese labor was seen as a what do they call it? What does Marx call it? The surplus labor force, or the reserve
army and
of
unemployed,
labor,
right.
of unemployed or
Right.
employed. The trade with China has helped to discipline the American working class, as well as global trade in general. What makes you think that whatever comes out of this of a possible agreement, or a possible détente, put it that way, with China and Russia, what makes you think that that could possibly be in the favor of the American working class, vis-a-vis our ruling class, given the ruling class is going to be the ones setting the terms of how all this goes down? I mean, they're very adaptive people. Finance is very adaptive. Corporate, multinational corporations are very adaptive. They'll always find ways to make their profits and leave the working class behind.
I think we have to try to exert some sympathy for a poor and oppressed class, a rather small class of people in the world right now whose actions may finally be most important in terms of these politics. The small oppressed class that I have in mind is the American 1%, the American economic elite, that has profited remarkably in the last generation. I mean, we have to realize that there has been 40 years of massive concentration of wealth in America, not only growing but accelerating in that period. So the concentration of wealth in America today is worse or better from your depending upon your point of view, than it was on the eve of the Great Depression in the late 1920s. This, after all, is the theme of the most important book on economics of the recent generation. That is Thomas Piketty's Capitalism in the 21st Century. So here we have this embattled, and by the way, here's a great parenthesis that I'm indulging myself with in the midst of this long and complex argument. The word embattled is much used and usually misunderstood. It doesn't mean besieged. It means in arms and ready to fight, ready for battle. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, there the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard around the world. It's talking about the Battle of Concord in 19th of April, 1775. The embattled farmers were not surrounded, were not besieged. They had guns, and they were willing to use them. So this is what we mean by embattled. So we have an embattled ruling class, an embattled 1% in the United States today, that is, in fact, besieged on two sides, one by the American working class that effectively put Donald Trump in office, and on the other side by an economically integrated Eurasia. Now, the American ruling class thinks it can handle both of these. It can keep the American working class, the American middle class, as we like to say in this country, oppressed, and it thinks it can handle Eurasia by means such as the control of energy. The Pentagon speaks of offshore control of the Chinese economy, and by that they means controlling the energy resources that China can get. Unfortunately, there are other players who have other ideas, notably Russia, with energy resources of its own. So what we have here is an American ruling class that's under siege. And, these guys aren't stupid. They're going to do something about it. What they might do about it is find some way to pacify the American middle class by doing something like Trump's infrastructure program, but on a serious basis, a basis that really would produce jobs. Maybe even doing something about health insurance on a serious basis. I think it's quite amusing that it's the Trump administration that's been talking about single payer in the last month after the failure of the AHCA. In these circumstances, the possibility of a breakout by the Trump administration shouldn't be discounted, both domestically and in terms of foreign policy. The leading Chinese billionaire, Jack Ma, says, look, the U.S. could have handled all its economic problems with no difficulty at all over the last generation if it just spent its money wisely. It hasn't spent its money wisely, says Jack Ma. It's bought guns and blown them up on the battlefield. That doesn't do anybody any good, he says. And in the meantime, the American populace is complaining, and indeed they are. At some points, the center cannot hold. At some point, the Trump administration or a subsequent administration is going to have to do something that really is in the interest of the American majority, and it really does moderate the economic and military confrontation with Eurasia. It's the push for war against Russia and China that recent administrations have used to try to redress the balance between a declining American economy, declining in terms of its control of the world economy, and the feared economic integration of Eurasia. Herb Stein's law that we talked about last week, if things can't go on forever, they won't.
Well, a couple of things, perhaps. A lot going on here, so I'm
yes, there is. That's the interesting point. There is a lot going on.
So we're sort of juxtaposing this possible Trump agenda with China and Russia in Asia, and larger Asia, to the Middle East, and the argument being that what they do agree on is that Iran needs to be dealt with in a much more severe way than Obama was willing to deal with them. So, and that the ruling class will agree on that, and the Israel lobby will support that, and the people who benefit from the $100 billion arm deal that Jared Kushner cut with the Saudis will support that. So Trump's sort of got that going for him in terms of consensus within the ruling class. Okay, so but now let's talk about as a kind of reserve as a way of bringing together the ruling class together, whatever their differences may be about Russia and China and perhaps other things. But let's also juxtapose that to other perhaps fissures within the ruling class. David Graeber did a fascinating interview that's on the Real News website. It's just it's actually not a spoken interview. I mean, he talks, but they just flash the questions graphically on the screen, which actually was a pretty good way of keeping things flowing. And what he argues, interestingly to me, and sort of novelly to me, that I hadn't thought of, is that not only are there differences within the ruling class, say among the Koch brothers type people, the energy resource type people, and the arms type people, and the finance type people, and the multinational corporation type people. What he's arguing also is that there has been a historical conflict even within the FIRE sector, within the finance, insurance, real estate sector, between real estate, which is Trump, and finance, which would have been Hillary Clinton. And what he's arguing, I mean, maybe this is getting too far afield from what you're saying, but he's arguing that there's also jostling going on there
Absolutely.
Because real estate makes profits within this country. I mean, maybe not solely, not that not that rich people don't buy real estate in other countries, but Trump has focused his whole life on how do you do deals to make money building something on this land. And finance, meanwhile, in the neoliberal era, has flown around the world with all their vehicles, with all their fantasy money going into this and that. And that wasn't particularly, that's not something that Trump particularly relates to all that well. And just to confuse issues even more, perhaps, but I think what Graeber defines as the corporatist agenda, he really defines as basically a Keynesian, the kind of economic nationalism that Steve Bannon supposedly stands for, again, against finance. This corporatist agenda, and maybe that needs to be critiqued in terms of how multinational corporations work as they've outsourced jobs and so forth. But he still feels David Graeber, the anthropologist who's written a lot about money and debt and is pretty interesting thinker on these things. He's basically talking about real differences within the ruling class about how they make their money and how they see this country and the working class in this country in relation to that. So what he's arguing in that is that there's this possible corporatist agenda that Trump also, besides the foreign policy aspect, is a kind of anti-neoliberal aspect that, for instance, wants to build infrastructure, that wants to employ real labor, making real things, put aside the whole nonsense about public-private partnerships and building infrastructure. That again, there are real fissures within the ruling class because people in the ruling class make their money in different ways, and they always have. And this is the way it's always been in this country.
And I think these divisions are being played out in the White House right now, which means sometimes we make a mistake when we talk about Donald Trump's peculiar personal psychology. His psychology may be less important, finally, than the groupthink that comes out of the White House, that comes out of the administration as a whole. There are certainly two lines in that right now on the issues that you're talking about. One represented by this man, Gary Cohn, who used to be head of Goldman Sachs and is now head of the Economic Development Council or something in the White House. And the other side is Trump's intellectual bodyguard, Steve Bannon, who was supposedly banished from the White House recently, but seems to be back at least with some. He's come in through the back door and has a few things to say about what's going on. The division that you describe is represented by the arguments put forth by these two, who don't like each other very much, in part because they're speaking for very different strategies among the American ruling class. Marx was not wrong when he said that under capitalism, the government is the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. And Marx, with his usual perspicacity, knew that the executive committee the bourgeoisie needed an executive committee. That is to say that its interests were not unified, as you pointed out, that they indeed could conflict, and indeed you needed to have a committee meeting, call it the government, that would get together and balance out those interests or fight out those interests. That's going on right now in the White House, I think.
Yeah, and I'll say something of a parenthetical nature here as we devolve from the political to the personal. It's that
I thought they were the same.
It's something I want to get off my chest.
Okay.
Is that it's never more obvious how difficult it is people to reflect on their own foibles and their own issues and their own blind spots than when they see Donald Trump as a way of unconsciously reflecting on those foibles. Not that Donald Trump isn't a big mess. He certainly is. I mean, at all levels. But when people reduce our political issues to again, as we were saying last week, what's going on in Donald Trump's head or whatever part of his body you want to refer to. It just shows, it doesn't show that much about Donald Trump or anything that we don't already know about Donald Trump. It just shows how so many people, including many liberals, many people who would label themselves as liberal or progressive, are unwilling to think structurally, to take the personal out of it at least momentarily, and look at how our material class structure actually works, and then only to reveal their own unwillingness to use a worn phrase to perhaps reflect on their own privilege and what they're unwilling to look at about what as again, as the sort of cliched saying goes, what is it that they're not willing to think in order to keep their jobs, in order to pay their mortgage?
This,
so.
I think this is a vital point, and one all sides are playing on in some ways.
Yes.
The psychologists offered us a notion, not original with Freud, but he talked about it, called projection. And projection is, in Freud's account, an unconscious process whereby you attribute unacceptable ideas or purposes or goals of your own to someone else. Look what he's doing to me. Mm-hmm. When you see that and you're projecting in this fashion, you are actually talking about what you want to do to him and or to them. And the projections into Donald Trump is a wonderful collector of projections, I think. Yeah. And that one of the first ways we could begin talking about American politics is to do what the psychologists call recapturing the projections. Bring those ideas back, admit them to ourselves, admit to their origin in ourselves, and try to understand clearly who's doing what and why, rather than expressing our fears that something that we can't stand in ourselves are being enacted by somebody else.
Yeah. And of course, people, perhaps rightfully, would say, well, what about you? I mean, what do you do, David Green? What are you doing, David Green, when you're criticizing this, that, and the other thing? Aren't you projecting too? And which sort of muddies the argument in a certain way. But, and fine. Everybody, including me, and even you, and even Joseph and Andrew, has their ways of seeing, of obscuring what could be seen as more real in the world in terms of their own psychology and their own blind spots. And fine. One way of dealing with that, I think, that I would at least aspire to, for instance, I had a letter to the editor this past Wednesday about a local personality, May Barenbaum, who's a professor of entomology, well known for her. She's more well known, I think, for her Fear Insect Festival or whatever it is.
Insect Fear Festival, yes,
Fear
right.
Festival, as
Movies,
well as
right?
for some of her own research, and of course she's a well-known figure and well-liked figure and beloved person in our community, and I acknowledge all that. I don't know her, I've never met her, but still, people like her can sort of look at the whole issue of the March for Science and the denial, the climate change denial, and the whole scientific issues behind that, and not really understand that, and then write a guest commentary like she did a couple of weeks ago, promoting science, promoting that science is good, it's good for business, it's good for culture, it's good for everything. We should all believe in science, and if we just believed in science, inevitably we would march forward. Well, why haven't we been marching forward? Why have we been marching backwards? Why has life been getting worse for so many people in spite of acknowledged scientific process and progress in many fields? And that's something that people, relatively privileged people, who don't spend a lot of time really thinking about politics and the way the world works in that way, kind of fall into this kind of escapist way of looking at the world. And that's not a unique flaw to her. I'm just, she wrote a commentary, and I saw that as an opportunity to point some of these things out about the fact that about cultures with highly evolved science and so forth do really horrible things. We're doing horrible things right now, and science continues to quote unquote move forward. Why is that? We should be thinking about that. It's not personal for me. I'm not projecting. Well, what I'm projecting on May Berenbaum is the fact that I understand what it's like to want to be relatively privileged and to think that the world is just a nice place because it's nice for me. And we have to resist that as privileged people.
Let me ask about a possible exercise of privilege by another well-known woman, not a respected member of the University of Illinois faculty, but a former Secretary of State. Do you think Hillary Clinton had Seth Rich killed?
I don't know anything about this. I'm out of the loop. I think I've heard the name. I think I've seen a reference to it.
The fact that we don't know anything about it, and it's not something that's that we're talking about, that's going down the memory hole, is, I think, one of the more interesting events this last week. It was revealed that a staff member of the Clinton campaign, a young man called Seth Rich, was responsible for the transmission of hundreds of thousands, perhaps not that many, I think the final number was 44,000 emails, to WikiLeaks. And that these apparently, this is still not quite clear, these were apparently the basis for the charge that Russia had meddled in the election by exposing the emails of John Podesta and the Democratic National Committee. It turns out, we found out this week, to remarkably little comment, that Russiagate, based on the notion that Russia interfered with our election by publishing the private emails of the Clinton campaign where they were busily scheming against the interests of the American people, that was in fact not true. That in fact it did come out of the Clinton campaign. Once again, all these things are matters of some debate, but it seems clear that the source of the supposed meddling was the Clinton campaign itself. But then the matter grows somewhat more serious because Seth Rich was shot in the back in Washington, D.C. and killed by something the police put down as a mugging, although the mugger, if that was who it was, didn't bother to take any of Seth's property, but did make sure that he was quite dead. Before, for example, he had a chance to say anything about why he had sent the emails to WikiLeaks or even testifying to the fact that he was indeed the source of those emails and therefore blown the whole Russiagate thing out of the water. In the crime novels, you know, they always say that you look for the murderer by considering three things: motive, method, and opportunity. And if you can establish those three things, you have a good idea of who the suspect might be. Okay. In these circumstances, the Clinton campaign had a tremendous motive to make sure that Seth Rich would not blow Russiagate out of the water by saying, I did it. Motive. Method. A street criminal in Washington arranged to shoot somebody in the back is unfortunately not unlikely. Opportunity, they had to do it quick because if it became clear that Seth was the source, he might talk. Okay. Now, Mrs. Clinton, obviously, she's above such things, right? She was the one who suggested droning Julian Assange. And Mrs. Clinton is not known for humor. The notion that it was a joke, let's drone this guy, you know, has some... And in fact, the one time we have an example of her humor was after the leader of Libya was sodomized with a bayonet by an agent of Mrs. Clinton, and her response was, "We came, we saw, he died." Ha ha ha. She did indeed giggle. You can see the clip. You know, she's giggling. Okay. Would she say the same finally? She didn't. She wasn't the one who came and saw, but Seth Rich did die. And
Yeah. Well, whatever. Hopefully, this isn't avoiding your question too blatantly, because I don't really have much to offer in this regard. But conspiracism is in the air, obviously, and again, back to the psychology of all this. Ever since I got familiar with the work of a guy named Daniel Pipes, I came to understand that conspiracy theory, those who often study and critique conspiracy theories, are often conspiracy theorists themselves. That there's a
You're looking at me?
complicated.
You're looking
no,
at me?
No, I'm not looking at you. That says no. I'm just saying it's a complicated business. It's a complicated psychological, political business going on here. And there's a lot of conspiracism in the air. A fellow named Aaron Mate actually has been recently hired by the Real News. He used to be one of Amy Goodman's journalists, and has actually done some sort of implicit criticism of Amy Goodman in his coverage on the Real News. But he interviewed actually someone surprisingly from all places, the new Republic, which I understand is now a new Republic since it was sold by Martin Peretz a couple of years ago, or actually he was fired from it and then sold. But
it's a new Republic.
There's a woman who I'd vaguely heard of, Sarah Jones, who Aaron did a quite good interview with about the liberal conspiracism that's in the air, of course, regarding Donald Trump and Russia and the whole thing. And the main subject of this conspiracist critique was somebody we've mentioned before on this show, a Brit named Louise Mensch, who apparently is just a complete lunatic, and is saying outrageously conspiratorial things. But it's not that different from what you read on almost the entire front page of the New York Times or the editorial page. Just this implied notion that, again, the political can be reduced to the personal, that there's conspiring going on, that there's evil people conspiring to do things, and that it all would be resolved if we would just impeach Donald Trump. So the question that's being formed, the limits of allowable debate in the mainstream media, that 3 months, well, I guess it's now 4 months into the Trump presidency, is should or shouldn't we impeach Donald Trump?
Yes.
That's the range of views that we're being exposed to now. Not even, let's talk about the psychology of this, or God forbid, let's talk about the real structural issues and conflicts in the ruling class and everything that we've been talking about on this program. But of course, not everybody can be as psychologically healthy as we are on this program.
We do what we can,
it's
right?
It's understandable, I mean, that's just the way it is.
It's been my experience that the charge of that's a conspiracy theory, is a remark that we hear from people who don't want to hear much speculation about why some political actions take place. In other words, they don't want to hear any history or usually any politics. That's a conspiracy theory to say that the U.S. supports Israel because it wants to control energy in the Middle East. That's a conspiracy theory. We support Israel because brave little Israel is fighting the forces of evil, and we're naturally good, and we're on the side of good. Okay, that's what happens when you start talking conspiracy theories. Let's remember your schoolboy Latin. Conspiracy means literally breathing together, conspirare. Those who breathe together and run the American government are the people whose motives we want to know about and who have a great stake in keeping quiet why they might be doing what they're doing. Our job is to try to see what they're doing and why they're doing it, particularly since what they're doing is usually criminal. And that's what Americans need to know about, and the perpetrators want to keep quiet. Let me take a specific example from this week. The American military, we call them the coalition forces, attacked the Syrian army at a place called Al-Tanf. Now, this was a decision that, in fact, Donald Trump probably didn't take. He probably didn't even know about it and probably couldn't find Al-Tanf on a map. Neither could most of us, after all. But Al-Tanf is a crossroads on the road leading from Baghdad to Damascus. That is, from the center of Iraq to the center of Syria, at least as far as politically speaking. The United States military, in an attack ordered by the Central Command, since Donald Trump seems to have given over to the American generals control of the American ongoing warfare in the Middle East, the Central Command ordered an attack on the Syrian military acting within its own country to try to suppress terrorist groups in Syria. Now, it's not just any terrorist groups. These are terrorist groups who are working on the detachment of eastern Syria from the Damascus government and the establishment of a balkanization of Syria and Iraq that seems to be the American military's plan for the region at the moment. There is no legal justification for that attack in the sense that the American troops are not legally in Syria at all. And America, according to the American Constitution and the Charter of the UN, America is not supposed to use its military to kill people without proper authorization, none of which, of course, exists in the attack on Syria and Al-Tanf this week. Okay, if we talk about that at all, we're charged with conspiracy theories about what the American government is doing. Not a conspiracy theory at all. It's an account of what the American government is doing and has been doing for a long time in its massive murder throughout the Middle East, now extended one step more into Syria in an attack on the Syrian army. Russia is involved, and the dangers are very great. This is the sort of thing that Mrs. Clinton wanted to do in Syria during the campaign, and that Donald Trump criticized her for. Nevertheless, it's being done. Who's in charge? Who's making these decisions? If this is conspiracy theory, then we need more of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, the dangers of conspiracy theory circa Daniel Pipes, circa the fanatical Zionists that made this a topic of conversation 15, 20 years ago and ever since. The dangers of that are that they think that Islam is a conspiratorial religion and culture, and that just out of nowhere, out of historical, religious beliefs, people are going to do stuff like want to knock down the World Trade Center, and there's nothing that can be done about people like that except kill them. That's the dangers of conspiracy theorizing, in the sense of using wrongly understood conspiracy theories that just pull things sort of out of context and ascribe evil to certain people, and then respond to that in a way that denies what our own country's interests are in the region and how those have played out. So there are conspiracies, and they can be properly understood, I think, as you rightly argue, but we have to be careful that that doesn't devolve into conspiracy theories that take our eyes off the ball, so to speak.
The task is to call things by their right names, to see what the various actors in the matter are doing, particularly when the actors are killing people in our name. Our task to try to understand what our government is doing and the vast crimes committed by the American government in the Middle East seems to be of paramount importance for Americans right now, and it's for the most part not being done. I was thinking in my dotage the other day that there are remarkable similarities between the American government in regard to Southwest Asia right now, and the American government in regard to Southeast Asia, what we sort of refer to as Vietnam. It was obviously more than that. 50 years ago, 1967, in that year, very few Americans could find Vietnam on a map. most people were vaguely aware that there was some sort of war going on in some Asian country, and that the United States was killing people in some Asian country. But it probably had something to do with the threat of communism and the need to stop communism before the communists took Connecticut. And so if Americans knew about the killing that was going on at all in 1967, it was in this half-hearted fashion. About that year, a remarkable development began to occur in American politics, and that was the development of awareness, of consciousness. Much of the 60s was an attempt to become aware of what was going on in American politics. And interestingly enough, in those days, it was frequently led by students. A lot of this began on campus. The anti-war movement was never confined to the campus, but it did begin there in a lot of ways, and that was important. That was an attempt to try to understand what the source of American politics, and particularly American overseas murder, really was, and to stop it. Long ago and far away, and the wench is dead, as the poet says, but the fact of the matter is that such a thing did occur, and it seems to me it should occur again.
Well, American exceptionalism has been a tough nut to crack by the alternative culture or the critical culture, however you want to call it. And American exceptionalism is still the order of the day in our mainstream media. Every conversation, including the ones like I referred to on the New York Times and what goes on there, underlying that all in the notion that America should, on behalf of its own exceptionality, have interests in the world that allow it to to consider and in reality extend its military power. And that sort of mentality is going to be hard to overcome because it's just so imbued in every aspect of our culture and media and journalism. We're still struggling with that, I think.
Two interesting events in the last couple of days in regard to awareness of what America is doing, what the American government is doing around the world. First involving Julian Assange, the head of WikiLeaks, whose prosecution by the Swedish authorities apparently has been terminated. The UK immediately said, it doesn't bother us, we'll arrest him the minute he comes out of the Ecuadorian embassy anyway. Yeah. And the suggestion is that they were once again simply doing the bidding of Washington in this regard, who wants very much to get its hands on Julian Assange. So the situation of this man who is remarkably responsible for giving Americans knowledge of what their government was actually doing over against the propaganda and conspiracism that we get in other places in this country. That's important, and the story is by no means over. Also, Chelsea Manning, who was responsible for letting Americans know about the crimes their government was committing, was released from prison, and it's remarkable to me that the discussion of Manning, and in some sense the discussion of Assange too, has centered on their sex lives. Now, what's going on here? To celebrate Manning for sexuality is a displacement, a counsel of despair, typical of identity politics, as has grown up in this country in the last generation, that minimizes Manning's brave resistance to U.S. government crimes. Julian Assange says, quote, "I was detained for 7 years without charge while my children grew up and my name was slandered. I do not forgive or forget," close quote. Well, brave words.
Who said that?
Julian Assange.
He said that?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know he had children.
Yeah. That's too easy.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just,
my point here is that the attention to these two whistleblowers is being put aside or attention to what the whistleblowers have blown the whistle about, what they've said and what they've revealed. It's been putting aside into questions of the personal lives, really, of the two of them. That's no accident. It's much easier to talk about whether Julian Assange is a rapist and whether Chelsea Manning is a transsexual than it is to talk about the fact that they've both told us about great crimes that our government is taking part in and that we should be doing something about. We should leave their sexualities alone.
Yeah, and I would add to that, as in speaking of people getting out of prison, the Puerto Rican activist Oscar Rivera Lopez.
Yes, that's right.
Was released from prison, was pardoned by Obama, and released from prison. And there's a couple of good interviews with Juan Gonzalez on the Real News Network, even though Gonzalez, maybe he'll talk about this with Amy Goodman also, but again, Aaron Mate interviewed Juan Gonzalez with a lot of good background about that. I don't know that much about Puerto Rico, to be honest with you, but a very informative interview about the way Puerto Rico is basically our Greece. Neoliberalism has basically eviscerated the economy of the island, and for that reason, half the people have left, or half the Puerto Ricans, more than half the Puerto Ricans, no longer live there, and there's reasons for that, which I think Juan Gonzalez, who is an eminent journalist, and goes back to the period you're talking about in the 1960s of that uprising, talks about very eloquently and very concisely and clearly in this in the couple of interviews that he did with Aaron Mate on the Real News Network.
I'm going to conclude this evening with a memory. This is what happens when you listen to old people. Sitting in the capital city of Puerto Rico more than 50 years ago, I was eating at a restaurant called La Zaragozana, which was one of the most famous restaurants in Hemingway's Cuba before the revolution, and they relocated to Puerto Rico after 1959. This was interesting to me, who knew nothing about the politics of the situation at all, simply to see what was happening in that part of the world. We Americans show a remarkable ability to ignore things like this. I was supposedly the privileged child of a good education, and this was all news to me. It shouldn't have been news. It shouldn't have been news, or the news at least should have been mentioned. You're watching News from Neptune for the 20th week of 2017, a Getting On to Armageddon edition, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, and a early happy birthday to David Green.
Thanks.
Produced and directed by Jason Liggett, not David Green, the program. Produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Joseph Cash, and Andrew Scollery, with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.